So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alan Rutter, and I'm going to talk to you about responsible AI in the public sector for this session. AI is obviously the buzzword of the moment, and it has been for the past few years. There's been a lot of pressure applied to public sector organizations to try and use AI tools to increase productivity, improve processes. But we are also aware that there are risks alongside the technology as well, particularly when it comes to connecting it to potentially sensitive sources of data, internal information. We need to think about what the ethics are that we can put around our use of AI tools. And the basic promise of AI was that it would give us, in effect, virtual or digital employees or co-workers that could go away and carry out tasks on our behalf. And that's still a useful metaphor. I'm not a big fan of thinking of AI as being human, but it's still useful to think of AI tools as a kind of co-pilot or a colleague that can help you out with certain tasks. But we need to consider the constraints of what those colleagues can do at the same time. I always think of AI tools as being like almost super smart recent graduates who have joined your organization. They're very quick at carrying out tasks. They're very keen to help you, but they don't have a lot of the contextual information or even common sense that you would expect people to have if other people to have who work within your organization. They don't necessarily understand the risks of what you're doing. They don't understand how your processes work, who your key stakeholders are, and so on. So there's a lot of guidance we need to provide these tools with if we want to safely get value out of what they're able to do. Now, I'll briefly talk about my background just so you know where I'm coming from on this. I started out working as a journalist in the dim and distant past, but quickly moved into digital content and then moved into working in technology roles. And then I worked in a lot of worked on a lot of products that involved use of data. And so that led me into doing training for lots of different public sector organizations on how they are making decisions with data and how they are communicating data through things like dashboards to different stakeholders within their organizations. That then meant it was a fairly natural step to go into thinking about what AI tools can do specifically in the public sector, because the constraints around what public sector organizations can do are obviously very different to what your average Silicon Valley startup could do. Where private sector companies might think in terms of potential reputational damage from things going wrong with deploying new technology, as public sector organizations, we have to think in terms of trust. If we do things with people's data that ends up being something that they don't like, then not only will they be angry with us, they're also likely to stop engaging with us in the future. And as public sector organizations, that's a disastrous state of affairs. Trust takes a very long time to build up, but it's very quick to lose. So we need to ensure that when we are deploying AI tools, we are doing it in a manner that is safe, is responsible, and that isn't going to break that bond of trust that we have with our service users or members of the public. So I've worked across a range of different central government departments, local government, healthcare organisations, and internationally, and talked about the safe deployment of these kind of tools. So what we're going to cover today is I want to get through four key areas, and then, as Daniel said, I will try and leave time at the end to answer as many questions as possible. So firstly, I want to talk about where AI tools can help with communications. Secondly, where it can help with connecting directly to the data that we have access to internally within our organizations and also other information. AI tools tend to consider anything to be data. So whether it's numbers or text or even images or audio files, all of that is data as far as an AI algorithm is concerned. So how we connect it safely to those kind of internal sources of information. I'll talk about the technology side of things, and I'm not going to deep dive on this, and we'll try and keep it as jargon free as possible. But what are the likely ways that you're going to encounter AI within your role, within your organization? What kind of technologies are likely to be arriving? How are you going to go about building AI tools? And then finally, I want to talk about ethics. Which goes beyond just the law, but I will touch on what the legal constraints are in this area, but really how we can exemplify best practice in how we are deploying AI tools, and again, how we can maintain that level of trust with our end users. So let's go to that first section, first of all, communications. So this is an area where a lot of us have probably used this at some point to when we need to write a difficult email or we need to redraft a document. That's when we might have leaned towards AI tools. You might have used something like Microsoft Copilot, for instance, for those kind of tasks. And this is certainly an area where there's several different stages at which AI can help you in terms of producing communications that need to go internally within your organization or externally as well. And I tend to break it down into four key stages where these tools can help. Brainstorming, first drafts, editing, and then what I would call enhancing or enriching the content that you're producing. So I'm going to talk about each of these in turn. At the brainstorming end, AI tools like Copilot can help with getting around kind of blank page syndrome. So when you know you need to produce a report or you know you need to write an email, but you're struggling to know where to start, this is where AI can give you some ideas. The advantage of using AI in this area is it can give you as many ideas as it wants to, and you can reject them if you choose to. So it can give you 50 ideas for something, and you might only select one, or you might select none of them. So we're not handing over responsibility to AI to produce things for us. We're just getting it to act as a bit of a sounding board, give us some starting point ideas, and then we can move on from there. So examples of what brainstorming could look like is maybe you run or are responsible for feeding into a blog for your organization. Now, producing content on a consistent basis to go out on blogs can be quite time consuming. And particularly if you're covering subjects that you covered many times before, it can be difficult to come up with new ideas for angles or new ideas for ways to present that content. So you could, on a very simple level, give an AI tool a set of your previous blog posts, the ones that have performed best, and you could ask it to come up with a whole bunch of different ideas for new blog posts. Again, there's very little risk here because if you don't like the look of what it's produced, you can reject it, but it's a starting point that allows you to then pick what you think is going to work and then move on from there. You could also ask it for a list of things to include in the document. So if you're writing something like a business plan or something that has a real specific format to it, you could ask it what components should go into that document. Most of these AI tools, particularly generative AI tools, are trained on a huge amount of text and they've read a lot of existing business plans or structured documents or SWOT analysis, anything that has a kind of framework around it. These AI tools will be familiar with that. So you can ask it to come up with almost like a contents list for, okay, if this is what I need to produce, what should go into that? And it can give you that breakdown. Again, if you decide to adapt that or you decide to reject what it's given you, there's no problem in doing that. So there's very limited risk here. Or maybe you're coming up with a new project that you're going to run internally, or maybe it's a public facing initiative that you're going to run, and you just wanted to come up with some ideas for names for that project. Again, it has a huge list of things that it's already looked at in terms of names for companies, names for projects. It can come up with a list of 100 things if you wanted to. And again, you can reject 99% of them. That's no problem. So there's limited risk at this level. A step up from that would be to then think about it producing a first draft for you. So maybe if you come up with your ideas for blog posts, you could ask it to write a first version. Now, I will admit that this is not often how I use AI tools to interact with my writing. I prefer to come up with the first version myself and then I'd introduce it more at the kind of editing stage. But if you are writing something that is fairly functional, and particularly if it's something that you've had to do many, many times before, and you're struggling to bring a new angle to it or a different way of thinking about it, then you could get a first version, which again, you might want to reject or heavily edit. What you don't want to do is be in a position where you're getting AI to write something that is immediately going out to an internal audience or to members of the public. There needs to be a stop point where you actually change what it's done, check what it's done, but certainly getting it to write a first draft of something is a plausible use case. You might want it to get to write a first version of one section of a document. So if you're trying to produce something like a business plan or a business case for something, initially we can get it to come up with a list of what should be in there, but then you might want it to fill in one of those sections and give you an idea of how that might look. Again, you probably want to edit it, you probably want to check it, but it can at least put some words on the page for you and get you around that kind of blank page syndrome. Or if it's come up with a name for your new project, you might want it to come up with a bit of a tagline or description for that new project. Again, it can one thing that people always need to remember with these kind of AI tools is it is a conversational interface. So you don't have to think that your first instruction needs to give you the exact output you want. You might get it to give you one piece and then get it to iterate and give you the next piece and then iterate and give you the next piece. So once it's giving you a name for the project, you might then want it to generate some kind of description off the back of that name. The third stage that I would use it is in editing. So that might be something on the blog post example, like, okay, you've come up with ideas for blog posts, you've given me a first version, which I've now played around with. Now I need to come up with a title for it, and I want it to be search engine optimized. AI is very good at doing things for machines. AI tools are pretty good at coding, for instance, if that's an area that you work in. But it can certainly understand what search engine optimization is, and it will come up with then a list of potentially SEO friendly titles for your blog post. You might want it to change the tone of voice of a document you produce. So maybe you've produced this business case for one audience, but you also need to have a more informal version that can be circulated to a wider range of staff internally. It can change things from being formal to informal. It can remove things like jargon or acronyms. It can explain initialisms. So you might want it to finesse some of the tone of voice of what it is you created. You can even use these tools to translate text into other languages as well. Now, there's obviously a difficult issue here, which is if you don't read the language you're getting it to translate into, then how are you going to check its work? But certainly theoretically, these AI tools can translate things into other languages fairly easily. Not only have they been trained on huge amounts of English text, they've been trained on huge amounts of text in plenty of other languages around the world as well. So editing is another area where you might want to introduce AI tools. You're still doing the work, but you're getting it to help you make changes, or potentially another way to use the editing stage is to get it to give you a list of potential changes you could make to a piece of writing that you produced. So I like using it in that way. So rather than getting it to rewrite something that I've written, I get it to act more like an editor and come up with a list of potential changes. I then have the option of either absorbing those changes or rejecting them entirely. So if it says you don't start a sentence with and I actually decide, well, I quite like starting that sentence with an then I can reject what it's giving me and just go with what I want to go with. So one thing you'll note through all of these is we are always trying to make sure that there is a human step involved, which allows us to overrule what the AI is suggesting at any given time. So again, we're not trying to completely automate the process of communication. We don't want things to be created and immediately sent out, but we can get it to either brainstorm ideas that we adapt, or we can get it to suggest editing changes that we can either take in or reject. And at the end of the process, we could ask it to enrich things as well. So that might be suggesting or even generating images for that blog post based on the final text that we've given it. So we could either get it to give us a list of what might be great images to use that we can then go and find through in our image library or through a trusted image source. Or tools like Microsoft Copilot can generate images for you as well. We can ask it to output things in a specific format. So if we have our business case written, but it's still within the text box of the chat within a tool like ChatGPT or Microsoft Copilot, then we could ask it to output that in a much more specific format, like a Word document. We can specify whether we want things in tables or in bullet point form. It's very good at adapting things from one style of text to a different style of text. So we can specify exactly what output we want. And we could ask it to generate things like logos as well. So in the project example, we might ask it to come up with a name for the project, come up with a description of the project, but then also generate a logo for us that we can use for that project as well. So multiple different stages where we could introduce AI to help us with our communications. The key thing to remember is we always want to be the arbiter of what goes out the door. So there is a concept with use of AI generally, which is called human in the loop, which is whatever process you design, you tend to want to have a human intervention at some stage of that. And that certainly should be at the end for sign off, but it might also be bits in the middle where you get it to do a small amount of work that you can then pick up and do something with. Then you get it to do another small amount of work that you then pick up and do something with. So for communications, this can be used for reports. It can be used for presentations. If you are using tools like Microsoft Copilot, you may play around with the fact that it can produce entire slide decks for you now. You can also use it within emails as well, and that can be an area where we do send a lot of fairly functional emails out, and getting it to produce a fairly formal but accurate response that we can then check and quickly send, that can start to save time. In general, with AI tools, I would say at the moment we're focusing on, we want to point them at the most time-consuming, repetitive, and kind of base level work that we do. So do think about things like emails. Don't think about things like, very complex pieces of writing that actually require creativity, creative judgment, and so on. Those are the things we probably want to hold on to. But for the functional day-to-day jobs, this can speed up some of our communications work. The next area where we can use AI tools is when we connect it to our existing internal data. And remember that data can mean numeric data that might be in spreadsheets or in the database, but it can also mean text, or it could even mean things like video files. Now, this is a valuable place to be placing AI because we really start to get better results when we can give it accurate information to work from. So rather than it swimming out on the wider web, we may well want to point it at trusted documents, policy documents, and so on. However, we are starting to introduce risk here, obviously, because there are data governance rules around the data that we hold internally, and we don't want to inadvertently breach them by giving AI tools access to things that it shouldn't have access to. So whenever you are connecting AI tools to internal information, you need to make sure that you're allowed to do that, and your data governance rules will vary by organization and the sensitivity levels of the data that you're working with, but do bear that in mind. So the first place that we can connect AI to some kind of data is by allowing it to go and do web searches. Now, this is one of the riskier areas to use generative AI tools, because as soon as you point these tools out on the wider web, the possibilities for them to go and find erroneous or incorrect information goes up massively. And also, there is a known problem with AI tools like ChatGPT, which is they're very bad at telling you when they can't find the answer. And what they tend to do instead is give you a very plausible lie. This tends to be called hallucinations. And this is so it wants to give you a good answer to your question. And if it can't find an answer, then it will make up something that looks very convincing. It will even go down to the point of coming up with a fake kind of citation from an academic paper that will look entirely plausible. So even lawyers have been tripped up by this, and there are cases of lawyers who have got into a lot of trouble for citing false case precedents in court because a tool like ChatGPT had pulled it out for them. So that's not to say we never want to use ChatGPT or Microsoft Copilot or any similar tool to go out on the web, but we do have to bear some of those constraints in mind. So it helps if you can be as specific as possible about what you want it to go and find. And if you can point it at specific sources, then that's also going to be a good idea as well. If you want it to look at Gov.uk to find an answer, then tell it to look at Gov.uk. Also, just generally specify that you probably are looking for UK-based information if you are based in the UK. It does have a tendency to all of these tools to go and swim back to the US if you give it free rein, because that's where the software was actually built. So if you're looking for UK-specific information, make sure you're asking for that. You can ask it to give you a very general briefing on a subject or explain a subject to you in simple terms. One of the things that I use fairly regularly with tools like ChatGPT is ask it to explain things to me as if I am 5 years old. So you can ask it to explain quantum computing to you as if you are 5 years old, and it will come up with a pretty good, simple breakdown of what that subject is about. So if you do encounter an unfamiliar concept and unfamiliar terminology, then you can ask it to give you an idea of what that thing means. As I've said, make sure your search is relevant to the UK, or obviously if you're based outside the UK, make sure it's relevant to your territory. Point us to specific sources where you can, and always check the sources of information that it provides you with. Now, most of these tools now are defaulting to giving you a source link for whatever they provide to you, but this can cause massive problems if you don't check the sources of information. Fairly recently, there was incident with the West Midlands Police, the controversial situation where they banned Maccabi Haifa fans from attending a football match. The briefing they pulled together for that was at least partially based on searches carried out by Microsoft Copilot, and Microsoft Copilot had invented a fictional football match at which there was supposed to be rioting and so on. Now, the very simple way to have avoided that problem was to ask for a source. If there was a football match where there had been rioting, there should have been multiple news stories on it, and you could go to a trusted news source like the BBC and check that that had actually happened. If you don't introduce that kind of check, then you are likely to be tripped up. And the problem with web searches and generative AI is because it makes up very plausible sounding kind of false information. If it's wrong 1 in 10 times, you're unlikely to trust it. If it's wrong 1 in 100 times, then you start trusting it until it trips you up. So we do have to have the habit in there of always asking for sources and checking those sources. Better ways to use these AI tools to get more accurate outputs are things like connecting it to meetings. Now, again, you will have to check about data governance on this because not every meeting you have will be appropriate to be recorded, and it needs to record it in order to do a lot of this kind of work. But certainly within, for instance, Teams, the technical capacity is there to record and transcribe meetings, but then you can then interact with that transcription of what was said in the meeting. So you can ask it to do a simple summary of what was discussed, but you can also ask it to come out with what were the ideas that were suggested, what were the decisions made, what actions were identified, and also anything that was left open. So was there anything we discussed that we didn't agree an action for? It will identify those kind of things as well. The reason that these tools are fairly good at going through things like transcripts and pulling those kind of elements out is they have been trained on, again, huge amounts of text. So they understand not just on a basic level what words mean, but what words mean in particular contexts in terms of the words that are around them. So hence they are able to identify things like what looks like an action, what looks like a decision. So you can go back through, look through the last 4 months of meetings and give me a list of all the actions that were directed to me. It's plausible that these tools can come up with those kind of summaries. You can analyze across multiple meetings, and you can even, if you were doing things more like maybe focus groups, you could ask it to come up with sentiment analysis or pull out themes from the discussions that were had. This is all stuff, again, based on how large language models, which is what feeds these tools, how they were trained was on huge amounts of text, so they are used to going through effectively unstructured text and extracting meaning from that text. You can also ask it to help you tackle your email inbox. This is definitely an area that for public sector workers is obviously a huge pain point. And so this is something where if it can do even half a job of helping you to manage what is in your email inbox, which probably contains hundreds of unread emails at any given time, then it's going to save you time that you can use to do actually much more strategic, critical thinking, important stuff. So on a simple level, and this will depend on it having access to your email inbox. So I would guess if you're public sector and you're in the UK, the most likely tool you're going to work with is Microsoft Copilot for this. And fortunately, Microsoft Copilot, because it's another Microsoft tool, can interact with your Outlook inbox. So it can do things like summarizing email threads. So let's say perfectly plausible situation. You go on holiday, you come back, there's hundreds of emails in your email inbox. One of them is marked urgent, and it's like a 30 or 40 email thread. You don't know whether that thing was solved or not while you were away. You just want to get to the bottom of what happened. That's where you can ask AI to summarize what's in that thread, tell you if the problem was solved, tell you if there were any actions that were assigned to you. And then off the back of that, you might decide to set up a meeting with the people on that email thread just to thrash out what had happened. It can pull out things like where you were mentioned, actions that were directed at you, or requests that were made at you. These tools are also very good at finding dates, which I find particularly useful. So dates that were agreed for meetings or milestones, it knows what a date format looks like, so it will be able to dig through and find those for you. It can draft messages or replies to emails. So if you do want to just come up with a fairly functional response to something that's been sent to you, then you can ask it to just generate that for you. You can check it and then you can send it. Obviously, the more sensitive the email becomes or the more tricky the problem you're dealing with, the less you would probably want to use just a pro forma reply. But there are plenty of emails we get that just require a fairly formal and professional response without much thought to it. You can get it to edit messages that you've written. So if you have got a sensitive email that you need to send and you've spent a long time drafting up a response, but you know that it's a bit wordy, maybe it could be made a bit more formal or informal. Uh, these tools are very capable of editing your text for length or concision or tone. And you should also be able to, if it can connect to your emails, it should be able to connect to your calendar as well. So you should be able to set up meetings and calls from inside something like Outlook or something like Teams. We can also connect these tools to documents. They work with multiple types of documents. These days, most of the AI tools that you're working with should be able to cope with the files that you work with on a day-to-day basis. Certainly, if you're working with Microsoft Copilot, then it's going to be able to interact with Excel files, Word files, and so on. You can ask it to pick up a document and generate a summary for you. So there are a lot of documents floating around in the public sector that are kind of 160 pages of policy documentation, quite small text, quite dense to read. So if you receive something like that, you can get it to give you a bullet pointed summary that then acts as a bit of a sort of contents page or a map that you can then say, okay, I can find the bit that's most interesting to me. Now I'll go back to the source document and dig out that exact information. So again, we want that human check to be in there. You can ask it to retrieve specific information. So if you do have a very long document, but there's only one fact that you need to pull out of it, you can ask it to specifically go and find that fact from that document. In this case, you are limiting the opportunity for hallucination because you are telling it to only find information from what you already know is a trusted source. So it should only go through that document to find what it needs to find. It's not going out on the wider web. You can ask it to reformat information. So if you have something in a PDF, but you need to pull something out as a table and put it into an Excel file instead, that kind of retrieve, reformat, and output is something that these AI tools can do. And that can save a lot of time, particularly if you have kind of pre-made formats for regular reports that you have to produce. You could pull in source information from multiple different places and then reformat it into exactly that format. Again, it can suggest changes for tone or clarity or missing information. So it can do the same kind of things that it would do with emails as well. So if you are writing up a report, but you know it needs to go to multiple different audiences, you could ask for the help from the AI tool in tailoring the tone for those different audiences. And finally, you can get it to work with spreadsheets as well. Now, within spreadsheets, it can do things like, particularly Microsoft Copilot, again, can do things like generating formulas for you. So if you've forgotten how to produce one of those kind of quite complex formulas that jumps across multiple tabs of a spreadsheet and generates a number, then you should be able to give it a natural language instruction and it will produce that formula for you. It can also, in a very automated way, create new columns, rows, create averages, create totals, and so on. It can dig out specific data points from a spreadsheet. So if you do have a large spreadsheet that's got multiple different tabs along the bottom, lots and lots of rows of data, but there is just one particular number you need to retrieve from that, it will know how to go through that and retrieve that number for you. It can do a certain amount of analysis. You do need more specialist AI tools. There is something within Copilot called Analyst, which is an agent which can do more sophisticated data analysis. But out of the box, most of these tools can do a certain amount of what you would call descriptive analytics. So they can identify averages, outliers, notable data points, and so on. What they don't have is the context to understand what other things could be extracted. So that's where you might need to give it more guidance. You can use these tools to generate charts and graphs. This is an area that isn't totally mature yet, so I still see errors and problems with some of the graphs and charts that are being created, but certainly this is something that is coming down the pipeline, where instead of having to fiddle around with options in a tool like Excel to create a chart, you should be able to provide natural language instruction, turn these numbers into a stacked bar chart with a target line, for instance. It would then be able to output that as an editable file. And you can also ask it to suggest new insights that it might be possible to extract from the data set that it's looking at. So you might have some things that you pulled out already from that set of numbers, but you could ask it to say, well, what else could I find out from this set of numbers? And it can give you suggestions. So that's another way that we can connect it to our internal data sets. Now, in terms of how you're going to encounter all this stuff, I've already mentioned Microsoft Copilot, and that is the reason I'm mentioning that is certainly in the UK, Microsoft Copilot is the tool that is currently being rolled out within most public sector organizations. So you may well have access to Copilot Chat, which is fairly default now for Microsoft 365, where you have a window where you have a chat box and you can type in instructions and you can attach files using a plus icon. There is then a licensed version of Copilot, which then gives you a Copilot button within individual pieces of software like PowerPoint, like Excel, and so on. That's not to say you have to be using Microsoft Copilot, but the fact is there is a constraint around this, particularly in the public sector on the data governance side. You have to know that you're safe to be uploading internal documentation, for instance, into these tools. So one thing I would say absolutely is you should not be putting work documentation or data into a free version of any tool. So if you've got the free version of ChatGPT and you use it in your personal life, obviously that's completely fine. If you're, asking it for recipe ideas or travel ideas, there's no problem with that. But in terms of attaching it to work documentation, you need to be using a signed off tool that normally is going to be paid for, partly from a security point of view. The reason Copilot is becoming the default in the public sector for this is that, firstly, it's a Microsoft tool. So you're already using all the other Microsoft stack. So it's an easy thing to add in as a license. But the other reason is it's from the security point of view. The principle with Microsoft Copilot is, firstly, nothing you upload to it gets pushed outside to, say, train the algorithm. Nothing goes back to Microsoft. But secondly, your Copilot should only have access to data that you have access to. So that means if you can't access someone's calendar, your Copilot can't access your calendar. If you can't access a particular HR spreadsheet, then your Copilot equally can't access it. So from a security point of view, that's the principle on which it operates, and that makes it somewhat safer than maybe some of the other tools that you might use in your personal life. The advantages of using these kind of pre-made generative AI tools, they are ready out of the box. So there's not any coding you need to do or particular configuration. They tend to be compatible with your existing systems. So if you were using like Google rather than Microsoft as a tech stack, then you might well be using Gemini rather than Copilot. But most of the tech stacks that you'll be using at work have some kind of generative AI tool attached to them now. So it should be compatible with the other work systems that you're using. There's nothing that your IT department or anyone internally needs to do, particularly in terms of ongoing support or updates. All of that is handled by the people who make the tool. So Microsoft is providing the updates for Copilot on an ongoing basis. And because you're using the same tool as a lot of other people will be, there is a community of other users that you can tap into for questions and so on. So that, for instance, the user forums for Microsoft tools are actually pretty well populated. So if you have questions, you can go on there and somebody can probably provide you with an answer. The cons of using these tools, there is a slight risk of data leakage. Now, Microsoft, as I say, are guaranteeing that nothing you upload to Copilot is going outside of your organization, but you would need to check that with people like ChatGPT, Perplexity, Gemini, and so on. It's less clear what exactly is happening with the data with those tools. So that is something you would need to make sure you were on top of. There is a lack of transparency about how these tools work. We don't have access to the underlying code with Microsoft Copilot. So that means that you just have to trust that it's doing things in a fairly ethical way. So it's more of a kind of service level agreement and contractual agreement with Microsoft, but you won't be able to see exactly how these models are working. There's a cost attached. So there is a per license per person cost for every person within your organization who wants to use Copilot. So that is obviously something that at some point you're going to be asked to justify in terms of return on investment. And there is limitations on how bespoke you can make these tools as well, because inherently you're getting the same thing as everyone else. So you can't really customize it massively to your organization. Another way that you might encounter AI within your workplace is through partnerships with some of the tech companies. So, for people who do want to build things that are a bit more bespoke, they might well work with someone like IBM on their Watson X platform or Google Cloud, or Palantir is probably a company that's quite controversial that you may have heard about in the public sector in the UK. There are questions about the ethics of Palantir, but they are currently doing a lot of work with the National Health Service and with the police. The advantage here is you can get something that's more bespoke. You outsource the complicated technology part to your tech partner, but you can still tailor it to some kind of internal use case. You effectively would then work collaboratively with that tech company, but they would maintain the technology and the servers and everything else. Their idea is that they want to build something for you that's slightly more bespoke, but they will have an eye on can we resell that essential solution to other people as well afterwards. The cons are this is way more expensive than getting the Microsoft Copilot license, so you would need to know that there was significant return on investment to embark on these kind of projects. You are reliant then on your partner. So if you do build something with IBM Watson X, it's going to be very difficult to maintain or adapt that in the future if you don't continue your relationship with them, which normally will be a financial relationship. You do need a certain amount of internal expertise at this point. It will take up some of your staff time to be working with that partner in order to make sure you get the solution you want. And if you don't pay for the upgrades and pay for an ongoing relationship, then your solution could go out of date relatively quickly. If you think about how quick AI is moving as a technology, if you build something now, is it still going to be working in 5 years' time, 10 years' time? That's something you would have to bear in mind. And then a couple of other routes to how you would encounter this technology. There are existing third-party tools that are quite specialized. So they might have been built using this kind of model, an organization working with a tech partner, but then that tech partner is now trying to sell that solution around more broadly. There's lots and lots of these. They do everything from, AI scanning for fly tipping, AI manipulation of contracts and procurement. So they're quite specialized areas. They tend to be pre-trained with quite a lot of specific data. So whereas Copilot, something like that, is quite a general use tool, these will be trained on a lot of specific data. So if it's a contract tool, it will have been fed thousands, if not millions of contracts so that it understands the construction of legal language. You tend to then outsource the work for this to a third party who provides the technology with some kind of service level agreement attached to it. So you don't have to worry too much about the tech. You're just paying them for the results effectively. And they will then build and maintain that technology externally. The cons of this, it can still be that even if it's pre-trained on a lot of data, it's still a bit too general purpose for what you need it to do. So it might be that it does a lot of stuff with contracts, but it doesn't do a lot specifically with public sector contracts. So it's been trained on a lot of private sector stuff, which might be slightly different. So you want to check that. There's probably going to need to be some integration required because it's not out of the box going to necessarily seamlessly mesh with your existing databases, software systems, and so on. So there might need to be some work there. And here, as part of your service level agreement, you would need guarantees on the security of the data that you're putting into these tools. So what you don't ever want to happen is you are uploading data that is being sucked back to the technology partner and they're using it to train their algorithm. They will always want to do that, but you are in danger of breaching a minimum GDPR if you do that kind of thing, if you allow the data to leak outwards. So you probably want to have that contractual discussion right up front if you're working with any of these kind of organizations. And then the final, much rarer way that you might encounter AI as a technology is building things bespoke internally. Now, this is something that several public sector organizations tried, I would say, a couple of years ago, but the expense involved in training models, hosting it all, building the servers, and so on is pretty much prohibitive for most organizations. Now, there is some places where this is happening. So central government at a very much like national level is building a certain amount of tools that can then be used by other government departments. The National Health Service is building a bit more that is bespoke because you need that kind of scale before you think about building something that is custom. Whereas if you are more like, I don't know, an arm's length government body, a local council, and so on, it's probably you don't have the scale to justify the cost of building something that's completely bespoke. But the upsides of doing this are you do tend to have complete transparency on what the algorithm or the model is doing, which is an advantage. You might have a community of other users because you tend to be building off an open source algorithm or model, and you can fully customize it. So you can customize it completely to your internal use case, and it will do exactly what you want it to do, but hugely resource intensive. You would need a team of coders or developers to be able to do this. You would need the correct infrastructure in place, which will mean cloud servers and all of the security that goes around that, which you will now be responsible for. And any integrations with your existing software, you would have to build those as well. So there's a huge amount of cost involved. Hence, unless you have a very wide scale for how you're going to deploy it, this is probably not a route that you're generally going to go down. And then finally, before we get to questions, I just wanted to talk about the ethics side of this. So, and also the law. So the interaction between ethics and the law is that there's two things you need to think about with an AI deployment. One of them is, can we do this? And the other one is, should we do this? Now, can we do this tends to be a combination of a technical question, is it possible to do this with AI? And a legal question, are we actually allowed to do this with the data that we're working with? Ethics is more about, should we do this? And that feeds into the whole reputational damage, or what I call trust part of the equation. Because if we start to do things that are technically legal, but actually break the bond of trust with our end users or members of the public, then that's a dangerous route to go down. Also, as public sector organizations, we shouldn't just be trying to just sit inside the limits of the law. We should really be exemplifying best practice in deploying AI tools as well. So this quote from Giovanni Buttarelli, who was the European Data Protection Supervisor, is a good one to bear in mind. Ethics comes before, during, and after the law. Ethics is an approach to doing things. It's not just a tick box of, are we just sitting within the bounds of what's legally possible? So in terms of legal constraints, one thing always to bear in mind is, just because AI is a new technology, that does not mean that we are absolved of our previous legal requirements in terms of handling data. So the Data Protection Act and GDPR are still very much in force when you're using AI tools. You don't get a get out clause. The basic principle here is data has to be used for a specific purpose. Individuals must know how their data is used. The data needs to be accurate and secure. The principle is we store the minimum amount of data possible for as limited a time as possible. Underpinning all of this is permission. We need permission to use people's data. And one hard question that organizations have to ask themselves is, if you capture data for one purpose, that doesn't necessarily mean you now have permission to use it for an AI model later on. You may have to go back to those people who gave you that data and ask them for their permission to use it in a different way. Now, this gets hellishly complicated in different parts of the public sector, because, for instance, in the National Health Service, essentially you can't receive care unless you give the NHS permission to use and share your data, because they need to know your medical history and they need to know your allergies and your medications and everything else. So there is a kind of default position of, you have given consent across, otherwise we can't treat you. In other areas of the public sector, it may not be as simple as that. And certainly don't assume that because you captured people's, I don't know, names, addresses, email addresses for the purposes of a mailing list, that you can suddenly pick that data up and shove it into an AI tool. Because it might be that you need to go back and ask for specific permission to use it for a different purpose. So do always bear that in mind. And if in doubt, find out who within your organization is responsible for data governance and information security, and make sure you are proactively checking with them before you embark on some kind of deployment of an AI tool. Then beyond the law, we have the ethical side of things. And the guidance around this is generally to think about applying the Nolan principles on standards in public life to anything you're doing with AI. So I'm sure we all know these off by heart, but as a reminder, they are on the slide here. So things to think about here is, we need to be transparent and honest about where we are using AI tools. One of the best practice use cases for this is in the city of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. The kind of local government there, they have proactively created what they call an algorithm register, which is a list of everywhere they are using AI or machine learning tools within the region. So anything that the local authority does goes onto that register. Any third party who wants to work with the local authority has to go onto that register as well. This is not something that's tucked away in the terms and conditions at the bottom of their website. It's something that they proactively promote. They've worked with local community groups, activists, and journalists to make sure that it gets attention. And so they are being very much on the front foot about saying this is where we're using AI. And for each of those entries on the register, it will say this is the benefits that we're getting out of this. These were the risks that we identified, and this is how we mitigated those risks. So it's being as transparent as possible. Obviously, we want to do this anything with AI with integrity. We want to be objective. Openness is the transparency. Leadership is we want to be demonstrating best practice. We don't want to be just about ticking the right boxes in order to keep inside the law. We want to be showing that we are using this in a responsible way. There are benefits from using AI tools in the public sector. We need to be shouting about those, but we also need to admit that there are potential risks. So we need to be talking about how we've analysed those risks, what mitigations we put in place, and so on. We obviously want to be using this for public good, not just for efficiency savings internally. The ultimate measure of whether an AI deployment is a good one or not should be about what value it brings to members of the public. And also, we need to be accountable for all of this. There is never going to be a get out clause with AI tools where we can say, sorry, the machine did that. It wasn't something that we did. Human beings are always going to be responsible. So we need to be confident that we know enough about how these systems work that if we get asked a question, potentially in court, we are going to be comfortable saying this is why we deployed it there. This is how that decision was made. Now, you can also think about how you would apply both the legal and ethical side as a bit of a process when it comes to thinking about deploying an AI tool. So there are different stages you might go through, and you can assess the AI, the data governance side of it at each of those stages. So initially, when someone's had a bright idea for could we use AI tools to do this particular thing, then at that stage you can do a bit of an assessment, which might be something like a data protection impact assessment to look at, okay, what are the potential benefits for deploying this technology here, but also what are the potential harms? So we're identifying those things right at the start of the process. Then when you can design the system, and design is not like what it looks like, it is how it works, but working through almost a flow chart of how this deployment might work, that's where you might want to look at, do we have the right quality of data? Are we eliminating things like bias, for instance, in the data sets that we're working with? And if we've identified some harms right at the start of the process, how can we proactively put some mitigations in for those harms, which might be human checks at several points during the process. Then you can then develop, test, pilot something. So you probably want to run it on a small scale to see what kind of outputs you're getting. That's when you might want to look at how are we going to measure success? How are we going to know that this is generating benefits? And are we able to explain how the outputs are generated as well? So if we do end up with an FOI request, AI, anything you put into an AI tool is FOIable, by the way, so freedom of information. Or if we have to justify this in an employment tribunal or a consultation or, God forbid, a courtroom, can we explain how this output was generated? Then you can look at deploying it. If it works and you've mitigated the risks, then you can look at, okay, now we need to roll this out. But that probably is going to involve some very human work around how do we train our staff on how it works and how to look at the outputs, but also what communication plan do we have in place with members of the public? Because one thing that, again, under the kind of data ethics that people need the right to do is question the outputs from AI tools. So are we being clear about how they can do that and where they can do that, who they would contact, and so on? And then we need some kind of monitoring place. So how are we going to assess the results from an AI tool on a regular basis, on an ongoing basis? And if we see that things are not going quite right, is there a process for updating, changing, or adapting those tools to improve the outputs as well? So a few points of summary, and then I'm going to get to questions. I tried to pack in as much as I could there, but obviously we've got limitations on the time. So a few things to bear in mind. Don't be afraid of experimenting with AI tools, but try and do that with as safe a data set as possible. So it's always a good idea to play around with these tools and see what they can do, but think about maybe using dummy data sets, maybe using publicly available documentation, so you're not using anything too sensitive while you're getting used to what the outputs are, what it can do, and so on. Start with the tools you already have access to. As I say, there's been a big rollout of Copilot Chat for those of you who are using the Microsoft set of tools. So that's the easiest starting point. You can do a lot of playing around with testing the boundaries of what that tool can do. But otherwise, you may have access to other bits of technology. Experiment with what you have in the first instance. Have a clear objective in mind. What would be the benefit of deploying or using an AI tool in this particular area? How would you measure that benefit as well? And that's a good starting point to think about how are we going to justify this in the future. There is no getting around the fact that quality data is essential for these systems. So the more you can point it at internal documentation, internal data sets, the better the outputs you will get. If you can point it at a trusted source, you're much likely to get a better output than if you let it go around and swim on the wider web. But that also does mean that we need to think about the security side of things. Because if you are connecting it to internal documentation, internal sources of information, that's where data governance comes in. Are you allowed to do that? Have you checked that you're allowed to do that? And we need to be open and honest internally within our organizations, but also with members of the public about what both the opportunities and the risks are in this area. And where there are risks, we can think about how we mitigate those, what checks we can put in place, and how we keep a human in the loop to make sure that is sufficient oversight on these systems to make sure they're not doing anything too dangerous. Okay, so those are the main things I wanted to cover, which means that we do have time left for questions. And I did see some things dropping into the chat, and I'm going to try and pick them up now. But if you want to drop more questions into the chat, that's where I'll pick them up. So, Stephen, you made the point about an argument for multiple councils getting together to collaborate and try and build shared tools. I think there is a big argument to do that. There are, in some situations, political, tensions between different councils. But certainly, if there are areas where you can work with other similar organisations to get that kind of scale, then you're more likely to be able to justify building something that is quite bespoke. Joe, in principle, I would say that the precedent has been set for anything you type into Copilot or ChatGPT or anything actually on a work basis is subject to freedom of information requests. So you should be bearing that in mind. The precedent was set when somebody FOI'd the then Minister of Technology, I think it's Peter Kyle, and they asked for everything that he put into ChatGPT. And fortunately for him, he just asked it which podcasts he should go on, but it could have been a lot more embarrassing. So because that principle's been set, I would default to assuming that anything you put into ChatGPT or Copilot could be FOI'd. So that's a good point. Is it Iki? So can you clarify when it is or is not necessary to state that a piece of work is AI generated and reviewed by humans? So there isn't a legal setting for this, and I would say that if it's been edited by a human at the end of the process, then I don't necessarily think you should have to state that that AI was involved in the process any more than you would have to say that something was spell checked. Now, if it was automatically generating something, like if you imagine more like a chatbot, if it was automatically generating a response that goes directly to the end recipient or the member of the public, I think you should have to state that. But if you are the person who checks it and then sends it out the door, then I think we're getting into very murky territory because you'd have to then state everything else that it checks. Word already checks your grammar and your spelling. We don't have to state that that's happened. So I guess it's where does the human sit in the process? If you fully automated something like a chatbot, I think you need to tell someone. And one area that I would say I would always push people away from using AI at the moment is for any kind of decision making. So I'd be amazed if there isn't somewhere in the public sector where people are saying, can AI decide who gets benefits or can AI decide who gets asylum? But I don't think the technology is anywhere close to being able to do that at the moment. So anything that involves a decision should be made by a human. But if it's content or communications, then I don't think you should have to state that unless it completely generated it and then sent it out. By the way, I'm not a lawyer, so any advice that I give you cannot be taken as legal advice. But from a kind of principle point of view, that's how I would approach it. Environmental impact, Eloise, yes, very good point. So there is an environmental impact. So for all of the people who are putting together plans for, how reducing your carbon footprint as an organization, if you start using AI tools, that is now pushing on the other end of the scales and pushing things up. Every single time you run a response from AI, there is a whole load of water being used to cool a server room somewhere. Now, that means we should be justifying that as part of there has to be a genuine productivity saving. This is why I'm not a massive fan of people generating images using AI, because I feel that people do it for quite silly reasons, to put something on social media, for instance, and that is actually quite processor intensive in terms of what it's doing. So I think you need to be transparent, that you know that there is an environmental impact, that there are tools available for trying to calculate what that impact is if you wanted to factor it into a kind of carbon footprint type plan. And that means you need to justify the other side of that. Is it saving some, is it making things more efficient or effective in some other area that will balance that out? The fact is, most things that reduce efficiency have some kind of environmental impact. So we should consider this in the same way. Um, So Kaya, you said how effective is it turning off AI being able to learn from you? So there is a toggle in most of these tools where you can stop it from effectively saving all of your conversations, and but therefore it can't learn about your preferences and so on. I would start from the principle that you need to know that the tool is not pushing data that you're putting into it outside of your organization. And certainly, Microsoft is effectively guaranteeing that Copilot does not do that. It keeps everything internal. So, on that basis, I wouldn't be afraid about it learning from you. What you tend to find is within a single conversation thread, it will remember the earlier parts of the conversation. What you can also do is upload, I think it's through the settings in Copilot, for instance, some kind of perpetual information or persistent information about yourself. So you can put into there, this is my job title, this is the organization I work for, this is some other preferences about me. It will then refer back to that every time it gives you a response. So if you're not comfortable about it just learning from you, you could just give it a set of instructions that it goes back to every time it gives a response to you. Maybe that's a safer and more effective way to do that. In terms of relation to bias, Haley, yes, absolutely. The training data sets. So there's before we give these tools data to work with that might be trusted data we have internally, they were trained on a huge amount of data previously, and we don't have control about what that data is. Now, this is part of the reason why I say I don't trust it with decision making at the moment. I'm doing a certain amount of work with law enforcement organizations, and I can tell you facial recognition is a real problem because I think the false positive rate for white faces with facial recognition is 0.04%. The false positive rate for black faces is 4%. So it's 100 times more. So that means it is on a much more regular basis identifying people who are black as being people who have an outstanding warrant incorrectly, much more than it is with white faces. So this is an ongoing problem. Any historic data, which is all you can train it on, is historic data. And all historic data has some kind of bias built into it that will relate to race or gender. So the main thing I would say here is that's partly why we want a human in the loop, that you can counteract that kind of bias because you are going to check the outputs. But also why you shouldn't involve it in decision making because otherwise that will just leak straight through and you won't necessarily know when it is applying those kind of biases. But definitely something to be aware of and concerned about. Any other questions that people want to put in? I'm trying to race through as many as possible. We've got 2 minutes left.
Alan, got one from Mark saying, does AI pose a higher risk in terms of vendor locking with transfers of AI models being difficult?
Sorry, cause a greater risk of what was the middle bit?
Um, terms of vendor locking with transfers of AI models being difficult.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely have that problem. And I would say the reason that most of you will be using Copilot is purely because it's a Microsoft tool and you're already locked into the Microsoft ecosystem. So that's something, you should look at alongside any other kind of deployment of technology. Certainly, if you partner with a technology firm, you're only going to be able to work with that technology firm probably in the future. If you're using Microsoft Copilot, it's going to be very difficult to extract stuff from that and put it into ChatGPT in the future. So vendor locking is definitely a risk, unfortunately, with this, unless you were building your own stuff, which is then very expensive. Anything you'd never put in Copilot from Kaya? Anything too personal, anything that I wouldn't be comfortable being freedom of information requested. And I would be very wary about anything that I would consider identifiable sensitive data. So if you imagine in the NHS, medical records type stuff, there are areas where they're using AI for that, but they wouldn't be using Copilot to do it. Um, Yes, that doesn't surprise me, Stephen, that an AI company, their entire data set was white people. This happens a lot. Facial recognition doesn't work as well on black faces because the training data sets were so bad. So Copilot to capture meeting notes, it could be open to FOI, and I would also check that what your rules are internally anyway for recording meetings. It is a powerful bit of functionality. However, not every meeting is appropriate to be recorded. Okay, I hope I've answered as many questions as I could then, and I hope at least part of this was useful for everybody. Obviously, if you have more questions, then please come through to Modern Gov, and we're doing a lot of work in this area at the moment. But otherwise, enjoy the rest of your afternoon, everybody. Thank you.